Hey, everybody. That's right. The Backwoods Badass is back again for and more presentations for you. Anyway, today's presentation is on Chapter 18, Politics and Government, as we get ready for the third cumulative exam. Remember, there is no final exam, it's only the third cumulative exam, covering just the last 8 chapters. And whew, it's starting to get cold here in the Alps. I may have to start wearing long sleeve shirts. Now, before we get started, I feel this was a tremendous oversight on my part, is that I never got back to you all on the bonus question as to, what came up as the funniest remark yours truly has made up until now. Um, I would have to say that the top votes seem to revolve around my story of my misspent youth drinking too much. You all seem to enjoy that one very much. But anyway, over the years, and I've taught this course in several different colleges, this still is the funniest remark I thought somebody made in response to that question. And I'm going to read it to you. I think the funniest remark Maynard has made in this class is definitely this question. It's funny in an almost pathetic kind of way because Maynard's jokes are really bad. Therefore, there is humor in it because he is not realizing the opposing reality that he is not very funny and needs a new joke book. Now, that went south pretty quick, didn't it? So my response was, Jim, interestingly, no one has ever quite put it that way before and passed this course. Where's Jim today? Well, it turns out he spent a few years in prison after graduating. Just kidding. He didn't. He didn't. Well, anyway, another sad chapter in my comedy history. Well, let's start off as I always do with a quote. This one is from Thomas Paine. Who was Thomas Paine? U.S. history. Doesn't help, huh? Is one of the founders. Nothing, huh? Okay. Well, he put out a famous pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, at the time of the Revolutionary War, see, we separated from the British, might recall that, the Redcoats. Anyway, he said he put out Common Sense. Now, at that time, approximately 1/3 of the people supported the revolution. Another third supported the British. In other words, that we should not separate from them and remain a British colony. And approximately another third were kind of in between. But when his pamphlet came out, Common Sense, which was widely distributed across the colonies, more and more of those undecideds came over to favoring the revolution. It's interesting too that after the revolution, which we won, by the way, a lot of the people who were loyalists to the Brits moved back to England. Thousands of them did, partly because it probably was not real safe for them to remain here because they were on record as supporting the British and not the Americans. Well, anyway, Thomas Paine said, society is produced by our wants and government by our wickedness. Ooh. Now, sometimes people complain and say, I'm paying all this tax money. What the hell am I getting for it? Will Rogers said, just be glad you're not getting all the government you're paying for. Winston Churchill, remember we talked about him before, Prime Minister, Great Britain, World War II, top hat, big cigars, party animal? Nothing, huh? Okay, fine. He said, politics are almost as exciting as war and even more dangerous. In war, you can die once, but in politics, many times. I found in comedy, you can die many times too, as I do in these presentations. Okay, now this is not a unique observation on my part, but I do subscribe to this. So this is all in The World According to Maynard. Government is always religion applied to politics. Let me say it again. Government is always religion applied to politics. Let's try this again, Maynard. Real famous saying, Maynard, which you can't even quote yourself on. Government is always religion applied to economics. Government is always religion applied to economics. Okay, so here's the argument. I'm going to make this case when we get to religion too, is I subscribe to what the great historian Arnold Toynbee said, all civilizations are based on religion. That's our foundation principles, whatever our religions are. And so despite the so-called separation of church and state. So first comes religion, then comes government. And so government is always religion applied to economics. So the foundation is religion, and government and the economics system kind of work hand in hand. Government works to prop up the economic system. Government refers to formal organizations that direct political life within a society. Politics is defined as the social institution that distributes power, sets a society's goals, and makes decisions. Okay, better get to the highlights because this is a long chapter. Should have told you to get some popcorn ahead of time here. Okay, we're moving right on to page 428, Politics and Global Perspective. But first, a quote from Oscar Wilde, who said, "Every great man nowadays has his disciples, and it is always Judas who writes the biography." You have to Google Judas to get that. Get back to me if you then think it's funny. Okay, Peter Berger said, Peter Berger is a rather conservative sociologist. He said, "One cannot fully grasp the political world unless one understands it as a confidence game." Well, a confidence game is the crime of obtaining money by fraud after obtaining the victim's confidence. Now, why does he say that that's the political world? Okay, so in theory, I don't want to say in practice, although we probably know this is true, we elect representatives, and then the representatives use the taxpayers' money in a way that may just be enhancing their reelection opportunities and maybe doing good for us. But the point is, we all have confidence in what this person's doing and trust the fact that the money he's using, or she is using, the taxpayers' money, that she is using it wisely and not just to facilitate his or her reelection. Okay, on page 470, you need to know the difference between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Monarchy is a type of political system in which there is absolute power, which is passed from generation to generation in a single family. So, for example, kings, queens, like the monarchy in Great Britain, which is, again, just a figurehead monarchy. They really play no role whatsoever in the government. It's just pleasing to the Brits to keep paying out for them because they like reading about them, I guess. To give you an example, so you don't think it's a bygone era, the world's nations include 19 constitutional monarchies, 1 constitutional emirate, 1 constitutional sultanate, 3 monarchies, 1 emirate, 1 parliamentary, and 1 parliamentary monarchy. That means 26 of the world's 195 countries are monarchies. That's about 13% of the world's countries. Aristocracy is ruled by the best people. Remember, this goes back to the ancient Greeks, ruled by the best people, the nobles, the upper class, the best citizens. Democracy is a political system in which power is exercised by the people as a whole, but typically as a representative democracy, as I just described, where we elect people to make decisions for us at the state level and at the federal government level. The Greek roots of the word democracy mean rule of the people or popular authority. Modern democracies are imbued with bureaucracies, which is one of the concerns conservatives have about how the government has become just way too big and is filled with all kinds of bureaucracies and rules and regulations that inhibit the functioning of business. The classical analysis of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy is Aristotle's Politics, which I've given you a few excerpts from, including my award-winning Aristotle impersonations. He favored aristocracy, the rule of the most able, but he warned that it could corrupt into self-serving class rule, which many people have argued that's exactly what's happened in America. His critique of democracy is this system grants an equal voice to all people, virtuous and non-virtuous alike. H.L. Mencken said, democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it, good and hard. Okay, so for example, when he says virtuous and non-virtuous, should the approximate, it's actually a little less than this now, the nearly 2 million people in prison, should they be allowed to vote? Now, typically we've disenfranchised the right to vote, and in a law passed, I think it was in 2018 elections, the state of Florida determined that people who were, the law there stated that even if you were ever in prison, you couldn't vote, and they got rid of that law. Now, most of these people in prison, as you know, because of the systemic racism in the criminal justice system, disproportionately, these people are minorities that were in the criminal justice, in prison rather, in Florida. So when they were released from prison, this was a threat to Republicans because most of them would register as Democrat because more minorities are Democrat than are Republican. So what the Republicans legislature in Florida did was it passed a rule saying they couldn't vote till they paid all their, money that they still owed for fees assessed to them and money they still owed as a result of going to prison that they hadn't paid off all their court fees and so forth. And so a leading rich Democrat, Bloomberg, paid it all off so that they could immediately vote because Bloomberg detests Trump and will do everything is doing everything he possibly can with his billions and billions of dollars to try to defeat Trump. So his paying off all their legal fees immediately enabled them all to vote. Okay, George Bernard Shaw said, democracy is a device that guarantees we'll be governed no better than we deserve. Mm-hmm. Okay, on page 471, democracy and freedom, capitalist and socialist approaches. This gets into that elusive concept as to what constitutes freedom. It's become quite the big buzzword in the current elections. I want to be free. Now, I will first of all point out that there's a difference between freedom and liberty. Freedom means you can do whatever you want because it doesn't impact on anyone else. But see, in a civilized society, we trade freedom for what's called liberty, that we give up some of what we want to do in the interests of living with other people. So, for example, to apply that theoretically, to apply it practically to the current controversy over whether or not to wear a mask, freedom would say you shouldn't have to wear a mask. Liberty says, yes, you should wear a mask because that's part of being a citizen of the United States. You have to look out for the rest of the citizenry. Well, again, what constitutes freedom is an elusive concept. Some would say that freedom is, if you go to a mystical point of view, it's freedom from thought, that your mind is free. Think about it. Think about how burdensome this mind is. I often laugh at the metaphor that is used in Eastern religions where they refer to the mind as like a monkey jumping around in your head. But think about it. You ever just watch your thoughts? It's terrifying. It's like this endless reel going on and on and on and on. It's just nice to be free from thinking. Why do you think people get wasted on weekends? It's just to stop thinking, they want to get rid of it. So anyway, yes, freedom from thought. Your mind is free. Then you're free. Or I think about Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for 27 years in South Africa. And when he was released from prison, he wasn't even bitter. 27 years he was in prison for trying to lead the end to apartheid in South Africa. And when asked why aren't you bitter? He just said, "Oh, I don't have time to be bitter. There's too much work to be done." But it was interesting because he was so beloved by the prison guards who he would help personally all the time that they cried when he was finally released from prison. And for him, it was just he never even thought of it as prison. It was just, I am now physically here, because his mind was at such a released point that it didn't matter where he was. He just accepted this is the way it is, and this is physically where I am, and I'm okay with it. So that's freedom. Um, what else could be a form of freedom? If you have lots of money. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was a president of the United States, World War II, Great Depression. Might have heard of him, FDR. He said, true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security. Yeah? See, when you got a bazillion bucks, it reminds me of what the Beatles once sang, oh, that magical feeling, nowhere to go. See, you wake up every morning and you got billions of bucks. You can do whatever you feel like doing. You don't have to go anywhere. See, and that's what's kind of nice about my phony baloney job, because at least I have the summer where I get that magical feeling, nowhere to go. Right. But freedom must be important because, and this is all in my book, everything you ever needed to learn, you could have learned from classic rock. The Who sang Freedom Tastes of Reality. Check out Global Map 18-1, which demonstrates political freedom in global perspective. Now, if you compare this map to Global Map 12-1, Economic Development in Global Perspective, you will see that generally there is a correlation between the high income countries also being those that are the most politically free. Economic development and democracy seem to go together, but which comes first varies around the world. In the United States, political democracy came first, but in Asia, however, many nations industrialized without being very democratic. China being a great example. Okay, I've also given you some quotes from time to time from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, written in 1762, as symbolizing, evidencing the thinking at that time of the Enlightenment. He wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." In 1985, 35% of the world's population was politically free, compared to 43% today. On page 472, you need to know the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Authoritarianism, any political system that denies the people participation in government. Now, technically, no society involves all its citizens in the daily activities of government, so every political system is authoritarian to some degree. So, for example, here in the United States, we have what's called like administrative law. So, for example, this occurs in every state capital, and it occurs at the federal government level, is all the different bureaucratic branches, like say at the federal level, Department of Housing, Department of Commerce, Environmental Protection Agency. Every day they have new rules and regulations that they publish and make available for the public to review. Now, and they're all put in the Federal Register, it's called. So, in other words, they are still operating within the framework of the laws that govern them, but they can change the rules within those within those laws, as long as they continue to conform to the framework of the law. And so these rules are changed constantly. Different rules are changed, and there are so many rule changes that on any given day, the Federal Register could be 4 100 pages long with different changes in rules and regulations. Again, this is called administrative law. And so what happens is we, the public, have, I think it's like a 60-day window of opportunity to comment on them, which doesn't necessarily mean they'll change them, but we can comment on them. And after that, they automatically become law. So these administrative agencies have the opportunity to create law, and we don't technically vote on it at all. The same thing happens at the state capitol when rules and regulations are changed by the government agencies at the state level. For example, in Pennsylvania, it's published in something called the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Again, 60 days for the public to review and make comment on, and they'll either change them or not, and they automatically become law after 60 days. You know, and I've always taken my cue in teaching from the Roman Emperor Caligula, who said, let them hate so long as they fear. Yeah, man, that's how I run my classes. Total fear. Pascal said, majority opinion is the opinion of those who are least clever. Well, totalitarianism. So for authoritarianism, think like Nazi Germany. For totalitarianism, think the former Soviet Union or currently the People's Republic of China. A highly centralized political system that extensively regulates people's lives. That would also apply to living in the res halls at Cedar Crest. Just a joke in case anyone from the administration is listening in. Well, anyway, think about this. You can only regulate people's lives if you can spy on them. And you could only spy on them starting in the 20th century with the development of technology that could regulate and monitor the populace, right? So the technology is the key. You can't spy on the people. You can't regulate the people unless you can spy on them and see what their behavior is and then attempt to regulate it. This is exactly why I continue to encourage you, if you haven't already, to read the book 1984. You could always watch the movie too, but the book's even better because that's what it was all about, the government regulating and monitoring us, which of course the government is currently doing. Not making it up, they are, period. Did you know there's cameras on satellites that can read your license plate? So, or there's cameras in all the downtown areas. And I know that's all to, well, you know, we want to make sure there's no crime being committed or whatever. Yeah, I get it. But it's also watching all the public too. Think about it. Every time there's been a crime, they can always look at all the different footage that somebody on some business's video camera. So it's pretty hard to get away with doing anything where you're not being videotaped by something somewhere, you know, who's watching you. I'm sure it's all good. You know, in 1984, they had something called the telescreen, and the telescreen was like television. But see, while you were watching television, the telescreen, meaning the government, was watching you, Big Brother. But it's all good, you know. It's all to keep you safe. The Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, he created the Chinese Revolution that created communism there. He said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Now, Confucius, he was a wise, ancient Chinese person. He said, an oppressive government is more to be feared than a tiger. Shows how things changed in China, huh? Okay, so to compare the two, authoritarian regimes are concerned mostly with overt compliance, do things my way or suffer the consequences, while totalitarian regimes seek to win the hearts and minds of their people. As is noted in the text, totalitarian leaders claim to embody the will of the people, but actually they try to bend people to the will of the government. So in 1984, Big Brother cares about us. Big Brother is there for us. And so the idea is Big Brother loves you and Big Brother wants your love in return, because why not? Big Brother is taking care of you. So Big Brother then uses your love to bend your will to Big Brother's will. If you go to China, you will see giant murals of Mao Zedong and the current Chinese leaders because, again, they're all looking out for you, you see? Okay, after the, you probably know, you probably read this historically. Some of us were around in 1991, I believe it was. The Chinese students, at first there was a couple of hundred, and then it became thousands, and then tens of thousands in all the major Chinese cities were beginning to rebel against against the totalitarian Chinese rule. They wanted more freedoms. And it was interesting because the whole world was watching. And so initially, the Chinese government kind of let it play out, went along with it. And this was going on for about 2 weeks, and the demonstrations began to grow larger and larger and larger. You might have seen the famous little video clip or picture of the Chinese student standing in front of a tank. And wherever the tank went, he would move right in front of it. As symbolizing their defiance of the Chinese government and the Chinese military. But then what happened is, as this went on, suddenly some of the generals of the military decided they were going to side on the part of the students and go along with this growing rebellion. And that's it. That night, the government had the so-called crackdown, and they just began wholesale shooting and killing the students. Hundreds were killed. We don't even know how many hundreds were killed, but hundreds were just mowed down. And that was the end of the rebellion, or the attempted rebellion. So after this crackdown, the Chinese government required students at all 67 Beijing universities to take part in a 1-month political refresher course. Also, all graduates had to spend 1 year working in the countryside or in a factory to get their heads straight again and get back into the program of authoritarian Chinese government rule. You ever notice how students are always leading the rebellions? Joseph Stalin, might have heard of him. Bolshevik Revolution introduced communism into Russia, which then became the Soviet Union. He brings up an interesting point. He said a single death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is just a statistic. And it's kind of true. It's not that, now, of course, not to the family whose member died, but after a while, it does become a mind-numbing statistic. And so is there a difference between 930,000 dead and 950,000 dead? So he said this because he killed 1,000,000 Russian citizens because they were not going along with the revolution at the time. Timothy Garton Ash, speaking about totalitarianism, said, whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together, there the party state desires to be. Alexander Hamilton, ever hear of him? I'll give you a chance to reflect on that. Hamilton. Isn't there a Hamilton Boulevard goes past the college? Isn't there, in fact, a Hamilton Boulevard building? Any connection? Yeah. Isn't there a play about him on Broadway? You're getting it. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton. Remember he had this big duel with Aaron Burr, rather. Burr accused him of messing up his reelection chances and never forgave him for that. And eventually they had the duel, and Aaron Burr, he snuffed him. Oh, spoiler alert. Yeah, sorry, shouldn't have told you that. Anyway, he was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he had a different approach to how things should be handled, which was very controversial among the founders. And he determined that, okay, how do you get a credit card? You have to establish your credit card worthiness. And so you have to take on debt to show that you can pay back debt, right? And so, usually you can at least get, well, actually in college, they probably send them to you like crazy, whether you ask for them or not. But the idea is, okay, maybe you get a gasoline credit card and you show you can pay that. Then you can get a department store credit card. You can pay that back. And then you can move up to Visa and MasterCard, and if you really play your cards right, you can move and discover. You can move up to, dare I say it, American Express. Yes, but anyway, you have to establish the fact that you can pay back debt in order to get better credit. So anyhow, he argued that the United States government should take on debt on purpose to show the rest of the world that it's credit worthy, that we can pay back debt. And the other founders said, are you crazy? Why should we take on debt? The whole idea is to have a balanced budget, not take on debt. Well, as it turned out, whether it was right or wrong, boy, have we taken on debt. I think it's now at $25 trillion, the national debt, and growing as I speak, particularly because of the pandemic this year. And we also have a trade deficit, as I mentioned more recently when we were talking about economics. The previous quarter was the greatest trade deficit. In other words, where our imports from other countries are far more than our exports to other countries. It was the highest level in, I think it was about 10 years. Anyway, Daddy Bush. I always differentiate between W and Daddy Bush. See, Daddy Bush was also president, George Bush Sr. and then George W. Bush. They were both presidents of the United States. I just know you're a little fuzzy on history, so I'm trying to help out. Daddy Bush, prior to the start of the Persian Gulf War, said, this will be the first test for the New World Order. New World Order? The hell's that? Now it's interesting because I read these really conservative pamphlets and so forth that are designed for extremely wealthy conservative people. And they were talking about this New World Order for quite some time. Like they're trying to create a New World Order. And the New World Order is an economic order, of course. And so they created something called the Trilateral Commission. And the Trilateral Commission, think about trilateral, 1, 2, 3. They envisioned that, this is years ago, they envisioned that someday there'd be 3 gigantic trading blocks. One would be a European trading block, another would be a North American, another one would be a Pacific trading block. And as they envisioned, just like the emperor, I have foreseen it and it has come to pass. Yes, Star Wars. And so everything they envisioned did in fact take place. Why? Because it's damn good for business. New World Order. Okay. Politics in the United States. Check out figure 18-1 to see how the U.S. government, the size of the U.S. government stacks up against other Western nations. In the text, the growth of the U.S. government is documented, in particular, the spending. Now, here's another take on if you ever get this feeling you're getting down on people who receive welfare benefits, look at it this way. You don't know anyone in the United States, including you, who isn't getting some form of government assistance. We are all getting handouts, folks. Well, anyway, counting federal, state, and local governments, there is one government official for every 6 U.S. citizens, as is noted in your text. Okay, well, is this what the founders envisioned? John Adams, second president of the United States, not the beer dude, that was his cousin. John Adams in 1789 said, the number employed in government must forever be very small, because the indispensable wants of all are not to be obtained without the continual toil of 99 in 100 of mankind. So he envisioned one government bureaucrat for every 99 citizens. And as is noted in your text, in colonial times, the ratio is actually one government official for every 1,800 people. Now it's one for every 6 of us. Yes. Let's see, the growth of the US government is also evident in the growth of taxes. So currently, the individual income tax in the United States is the largest producer of tax revenue of any particular tax in the world. It brings in about 48% of the federal government revenue. Corporate taxes. Now, I don't have the current update on this. It used to be 14%, but that was before Trump passed that law 2 years ago that dramatically slashed corporate taxes. So now it's much less than that. Social Security, retirement, and insurance premiums is 36% of the intake. Excise, customs, estate, and gift taxes 2%, although that also has dropped because estate and gift tax laws were changed dramatically that ultimately benefit rich people. Now, here's my point. Let's say the corporate tax take is dropped by 4 or 5% as a result of that tax law. And let's say the estate gift tax drops another 1%. So let's just say conservatively, that's 5% of revenues that we're no longer receiving because of slashing corporate taxes and gift taxes. My question is, well, where's that money going to come from? Do we go into deeper debt? Do we pass taxes on the rest of us in order to make up for that? But somehow you got to make up for that revenue or just go deeper and deeper in debt. So we took the measure of going deeper and deeper in debt because every year since that law has been passed, we add another $1 trillion to our deficit of money we're not taking in from the taxes that were lost because of that tax law. Where does the money go? 21% goes to Social Security benefits, 28% goes to Medicare. That's 49% of the entire federal budget goes to those two programs. National defense, including veterans benefits, approximately 24%. It depends on the budget that year, who's in the White House, how much government spending is taking place on defense. Health and education, about 13%. Paying off the interest in our debt is about 7%. Now, that keeps going up because our debt keeps going up. So when you say interest on the debt, that means if you buy a U.S. savings bond, you buy it, and the idea is by holding that bond, so let's say you paid, I don't know, $200 in treasury bonds, that means you get interest on that. Not much these days, but you get interest on it until it comes to maturity. So every year you're getting, say, I don't know, whatever the percentage is right now, but it's effectively, not effectively, it's loaning the federal government money, and in return, the federal government will give you interest on that loan. By the way, maybe I mentioned this before, maybe I didn't, who knows, I say so many things. Some of what I say is even worthwhile, but approximately 15% of our debt is held by China. So yeah, that's right. 15% of our debt is held by China. In other words, that they own treasury bonds. Now, what does this mean? It means they got kind of a lot of leverage on us, you know? So what if all of a sudden they said, hey, we want to cash out? There's no way we can instantly pay them that 15% any more than if everybody in America went to the bank and said, hey, we all want our money. It's impossible. They don't have all that money sitting there. So, you know, I often think about this, like there are the things the Chinese leader says, and there are things the United States leader says that's really for the benefit of us, you know, but behind the scenes, we all understand the arrangement. Hey, by the way, the Chinese own 50% of our debt. And by the way, we got thriving businesses in China, business arrangements between them and us. And so we're not going to throw that aside. Okay, on physical and community development, 3%. On law enforcement, 2% of the federal budget. And only because it's totally under control, only 1% of the federal budget goes to the natural environment. Okay. Now, mandatory spending. Now, this is like, okay, the government is obligated to spend on these programs. We can cut them back a little bit, but until we do away with the programs, there is mandatory, it's called mandatory spending. Social Security amounts to $2,884 per person per year. I saw an interesting letter to an editor the other day where the letter the week before said, listen, if you oppose socialism, then you should stop taking Social Security and Medicare because they are forms of socialism, which is exactly correct. Now, the response was, no way, because I pay into these systems and therefore all I'm doing is getting my money back. That's not quite accurate because there is no way that there's enough money in the Social Security system to pay back what you have in fact contributed over the years. I mentioned before that within 2.5 years, the average person has already spent, has received in Social Security benefits all the money that person contributed while he or she was working in just 2.5 years. So if the person continues to be retired, where's the money coming from? We, the people. That's called socialism. All right, so Social Security amounts to $2,884 per person. Medicare is $2,100 per person. Food stamps cost us $241 per person. Medicaid, medical assistance to low-income people, $1,100 per person. Supplemental security income, $188 per person, and unemployment benefits, $113 per person. Now that's in normal times. Obviously, with the pandemic and the need for greater unemployment, that money is going up. Let's see, total mandatory spending is projected to jump to 14% of the country's gross domestic product, in other words, our total output by the year 2025. And unless things change by 2025, mandatory spending will consume 78% of all federal revenues. How much do we spend on defense? About $1,775 per person. On education, about $1,340 per person, which comes out to about $12,000 per student. To pay off our interest on our debt, about $868 per person. But unless things change, by the year 2025, we'll be paying $2,300 per person just to pay off our debt. But don't worry, it's all under control. Okay, have you ever heard of the concept Tax Freedom Day? Yes? No? Some? No? Okay. Tax Freedom Day is sort of like a hypothetical concept. So the idea is, let's say we all start working on January 1, right? And so the idea is, at what point in the calendar year are we done paying all of our taxes, federal, state, and local taxes, at which point then the rest of the money we earned that year, in theory, is ours. Well, Tax Freedom Day in the United States in 1900 was January 22nd. So you worked approximately 1 month to pay off all your taxes, and then the other 11 months of the year, so to speak, it's all your money and the banks and whoever else you owe money to. Currently, it's April 24th. Little change there. Notice how the taxes seem to have gone up since 1900. January 22nd in 1900. Today, it's April 24th. In India, it's March 14th. In Australia, it's the same as ours. In the United Kingdom, June 1st, and in Canada, June 20th. So in those countries that are even more socialistic than ours, because we also have socialism in our system, half the year is paid for to provide benefits for to pay the government benefits. Now, but remember, like in Canada or in the Western European countries, they have cradle to grave security as a result of those payments. Ronald Reagan, remember him? President, United States, 1980s. Yeah. He said, government exists to protect us from each other. We can't afford the government it would take to protect us from ourselves. Okay, think about that. See, that's one of the arguments about should we legalize or not legalize drugs, and people say, well, you can't legalize drugs. Many of them are too harmful for people. Okay, but we have legal alcohol and tobacco. So the larger question is, does the government have a responsibility to protect us from ourselves? Well, clearly it doesn't, because as Ronald Reagan even pointed out, we can't afford that. And so that's why we have laws like you don't want to wear a seatbelt, you don't have, a motorcycle helmet, you don't have to. And so that's your right, because we can't protect you from yourself. But we make that argument that we can't legalize certain drugs because we have to protect the people from themselves. Okay, well then where's the Twinkie police? We had to have people standing outside the supermarket looking at the crap we put in our baskets going, you can't put that in there, you're going to get a heart attack or whatever. So of course we can't do that. So what I'm getting at is we selectively apply that principle, which again is inconsistent logic for those of you who are critical thinking fans. And I hope you all are. Okay, political parties are organizations operating within the political system that seek control of the government. By the way, a lot of the founders were totally against political parties because they could foresee what was going to happen. And this election year is a really good example. Ronald Reagan said, no, wait, I better set this up. Do you remember? Do you remember what is considered the world's oldest profession? Think about that. World's oldest profession. Yes, it's prostitution. Okay, got to set the joke up. Ronald Reagan said, politics is supposed to be the world's second oldest profession. I have come to realize that it bears a very close resemblance to the first. Well, in a sense, political parties are dysfunctional in limiting the available strategies for significant change. Recent polls have found that nearly half the people see no essential difference between Democrats and Republicans, just different variations on the same theme. Well, having said that, they do see significant differences in terms of, look at the current political debates. But if you think about it, they are just different variations on the same old capitalist theme of we're going to keep capitalism. There's just going to be this vision of it and that vision of it. And certainly, too, people are voting these days according to which party or which leader they think embodies their larger value systems. I have no idea who said this, so we're going to attribute it to Ms. Anonymous. How come we choose from 50 people for Miss America, but only 2 for president? It's a really good point. Okay, page 475. For the exam, you need to know about the political spectrum in the United States. Let's see. Okay, so when people talk about the political right, if you ever heard that term, imagine this is on a continuum, more or less. So the political right are people who are conservative. Currently, most conservatives vote Republican. The political left is liberals. Currently, most liberals vote Democrat. Now, it hasn't always been that way as the parties changed themes over the years. But anyway, so when you talk about the political left, you're talking about liberals and currently Democrats. If you talk about the political right, you're talking about conservatives and typically Republicans. Extreme liberalism, if you go to the far end of liberalism, it takes you to communism in the political left. If you go to the extreme end of the political right, it takes you to authoritarianism. Now, critically, most US citizens see themselves around the middle of the road, moderates. And so even in this election, the real key is how are the independents going to vote? In the 2016 election, disproportionately, people in the middle either didn't vote or they voted for Trump because many of them disliked Hillary Clinton. It'll be interesting to see how it goes this year, and a lot of the polling services. And for those of you who are watching this historically, this presentation took place just before the 2020 election of Trump versus Biden. But anyway, so now they're tracking those middle of the roaders, the independents, to see how they're voting this year. And in some cases, they're seeing just the opposite. People who can't stand Trump are now voting for Biden, not because they endorse Biden, they just can't stand Trump. The exact, the flip side of what happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016. Now, why is this important? Because you will notice, just for example, you will notice how Biden is going out of his way to say that he is not one of these extreme leftists like AOC or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren that so many young people embrace. no, 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 no. I don't embrace those, because he knows if he embraces those policies, his chances of getting elected are slim and none. And so you have to appear somewhere in the middle of the road in order to get elected. I've watched historically how in primary elections, Mitt Romney was a really great example when he ran for president. He is a moderate, as you can see now with his policies. He's one of the few Republicans who was willing to take on Trump. So he's a moderate Republican. Anyway, moderate meaning he'll go back and forth between, he'll vote for some of the Democratic policies, he'll endorse some of the Republican policies. But when he ran for the primary, the Tea Party demanded that he show much more right-wing conservatism, or they weren't going to, give him the primary vote, in which case he couldn't even run for the general election. Okay, so he took on some of those policies. Then when he ran for president, those came back to haunt him, because it was very difficult for him to portray himself as a moderate. Hey, I'm just the middle of the road. Well, what about those policies you just endorsed 2 months ago so that you could get through the primary? And some of that led to his defeat by Obama. Okay, so conservatives are typically Republican. Their economics are to limit government spending, to limit government intervention into the economy, to minimize government regulations of the economy. They tend to be pro-business, and they endorse the traditional values of self-reliance, individualism, and freedom. Socially, they favor the death penalty, oppose abortion, oppose civil rights legislation like affirmative action, oppose welfare, and oppose the women's movement. So they are personified precisely, for example, by Trump today. Liberals tend to be Democrats. The economic policies are to favor government spending to solve social problems. They tend to be pro-worker rather than pro-business. They believe the government's responsibility is to create social justice, and they favor the traditional values of equality and equal opportunity. Now, I hasten to point out, both sides favor traditional values. They're just different ones. They're all part of the American values. Socially, they oppose the death penalty. They favor civil rights legislation. They support the women's movement. They tend to be pro-choice and supportive of welfare. So historically, this was people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Carter, Clinton, Obama, and currently Biden. If you go back to Republican administrations, Ronald Reagan really personified conservative policies, and he's kind of the hero, the bright shining star for the Republican Party. Great stand-up comedian from the 1960s, Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce kind of set the tone for comedians making social commentary. He said, liberals can understand anything except the people who don't understand them. Yeah, little burn on the liberals there. But you also have mixed positions, where the wealthy tend to be economic conservatives, but are social liberals, and they could be Republican or Democrat. You also have the low-income working class, who tend to be economic liberals and social conservatives. Many of those you currently see are supporting Trump. But in the past, that same working class was more supportive of the Democrats. So that's a big struggle too, because these were blue-collar union members who came out strongly in support of Trump in 2016, but historically, they always voted with the Democrats. So it's going to be real interesting to see how union members go this time as to whether or not they felt, Trump in his 4 years did enhance their working opportunities or did not. Lyndon Johnson, ever hear of him? President, United States. Yeah, that's right. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he became president, passed all that welfare legislation, passed the Civil Rights Act. Anyway, he said, what's the difference between a cannibal and a liberal? A cannibal doesn't eat his friends. Liberals are taking a lot of hits here. Matthew Hudson wrote in Politico.com, for years, it's been conservatives who have been branded as intolerant. But conservatives will tell you that liberals demonstrate their own intolerance using political correctness as a weapon of oppression, or more specifically now, the woke movement. So who's right? Recent research confirms that conservatives, liberals, the religious, and the non-religious are each prejudiced against those with opposing views. But surprisingly, each group is about equally prejudiced. While liberals might think of themselves as more open-minded, they are no more tolerant of people unlike them than their conservative counterparts are. Political understanding might stand a chance if we could first put aside the argument over who has that bigger problem. The truth is, we all do. We just will not listen to the other side and try to understand. Henry David Thoreau said, could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for just an instant? Okay, on page 476, you need to know party identification in the United States. You will see it. It's there on that page. You will see that, and the question is, who do you favor or lean to? Democrats. 47%, this is as of 2016, 47% favor or lean, 47% of the public favor or lean toward Democrats, 40% favor or lean toward Republicans, and 13% refer to themselves as independents. This lack of strong party identification is one reason each of the two major parties gains or loses power from election to election. And you're seeing that in this current election. People who voted Democrat before are now voting Republican, and people who voted Republican before are now going to vote Democrat. You'll also see, according to National Map 18-1, and this is a political truism, people in urban areas typically vote Democratic, in rural areas Republican. As one goes up the income scale, the more the vote is Republican. So, just to give you an example, in Pennsylvania, it used to be a swing state. Then for the last 30 years, up until 2016, it was a solid blue state, Democrat state. And then Trump won the state by 40,000 votes, which was an amazing feat, considering it was considered a solid Democratic state up until then. Now, here's how it works in Pennsylvania, but you will see when you watch the national maps or the state maps during the election, when you watch the election night returns, although in this election, it probably is going to take weeks before we know who the actual winner was. But you will notice that in the rural areas, it's almost all Republican conservative voters. But in the urban areas, it's primarily minorities. You know, in the hinterlands, in the rural areas, it's typically white people, conservative, Republicans. But in the cities, it's more predominantly minorities, and who unfortunately are typically low income as well. Okay, so the key becomes in Pennsylvania, and up until 30 years ago, it was like, okay, so in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, can the Democrats get the vote out? Because if you look at the numbers, Democrats out-register Republicans 47% to 40%, sometimes even greater than that. So you would think, well, they should win every election, but they don't. And the reason why is because Republicans vote more than do Democrats, meaning that more of the Republicans will come out to vote, the more the Democrats will. And so for the Democrats, the issue is always this: how do we get out the vote? How do we get out the vote? So you'll see a lot of the campaigns, you know, and I'll give the benefit of the doubt to many of them, are neutral in saying, get out and vote. But a lot of that is code for liberals going, get out to vote. Get it? As in vote Democrat. So this is going to be, again, the key to this election. Now, in Pennsylvania, again, it was Pittsburgh and Philadelphia up until 30 years ago. But then a new metropolitan area began to develop called the Lehigh Valley. That was another, that again was primarily Democratic, although Northampton County tends to be more Republican, Lehigh more Democrat, although Lehigh outnumbers Northampton County. So anyway, having said all that, that third metropolitan area began to carry the state as consistently Democrat. So the next key is the suburbs. Now the suburbs, for example, around Philadelphia, were often wealthier people who tended to vote Republican, but that's all changing now. Now it's just the average schmo, middle-class people, many of whom are Democrat. So the suburbs are becoming overwhelmingly Democrat. And so, you know, this is going to be the key in this election. Can the Republicans in the hinterlands, in the rural areas, overcome the growing power of the suburbs that are increasingly Democrat? Okay. For your interest, check out figure 18-2 to look at party identification of college students from 1970 to 2012. In 2016, many of the millennials were highly supportive of Bernie, and understandably so. And as a result, many of them decided, well, when Hillary got the nomination, which they thought was a fix, and it may well have been, but you know, the party can do whatever the hell it wants, which is again another one of the problems with parties. But anyway, once that they realized that Hillary's going to get the nomination, many of them were pissed off and refused to vote for or vote for another candidate. I don't think the numbers added up in a way that the millennials who chose not to vote cost Hillary the election in Pennsylvania, but it did make a difference, you know, and so it'll be interesting to see if the millennials, whose heroes Bernie and Elizabeth Warren didn't get the nomination, but Joe Biden did, will they still endorse Biden? In other words, do they feel it's more important to have Biden in than Trump? You know, speaking of political parties, reminds me of a couple of stories. My next door neighbor was running for township commissioner, and at the time I was independent. He said, "Listen, Maynard, could you register as Republican? Because I'm Republican. I want to get through the primary." And I thought, oh, I always wanted a politician in my hip pocket to do my bidding. And I went, yes, I will do this. And so I don't know, I never bothered to change. By the way, I didn't win the election, but I never bothered to change. So when I go in to vote, you know, for the primaries, there I am in my, I don't know, tie-dye shirt and shorts and, you know, Converse sneakers. And I get the elevator look from the election official that goes, "Democrat, huh?" And I go, "Nah, Republican." And they go, "Hey, it's the Republican Party, right? Hey, party, yeah." Yeah, they're not amused either. But it also reminds me of my school days, folks. I don't know, you probably didn't realize I was quite the politician in my school days. And I don't want to brag, but for 3 straight years, I was elected class president. Now, it's because I ran under the party, if you get my drift on that. And my policy is, if as your president, I will do nothing. And I came through, and year after year, I was reelected. Now, I also had another slogan. Now, back in the 1940s, see, I got to set this up again. Back in the 1940s, and I'm blanking on who the politician was, but he was running against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this was during the Great Depression. Maybe FDR even said, I don't remember anymore. I should go look it up, but who has the time for facts? You know, only presidents have time to look up facts. Anyway, so the candidate said a chicken in every pot, you know, because people were starving, you know, so he promised if he was elected, there'd be a chicken in every pot. So I was running during the 60s for class president, and my campaign slogan was pot in every chicken. And boy, did that win the day or what? Well, enough of me. There'll certainly be room for more of me later on. The policies of the major United States parties have shifted over time. Republicans were the party of civil rights in the 1800s. You might recall Lincoln was a Republican. Now Democrats claim to be so. Democrats supported large deficits in the 1960s until the Republican Reagan administration made an art form out of it by tripling the deficit in just 8 years because of two major tax laws that slashed tax rates for the rich from like 80% down to just 37 or 38%. Democrats supported foreign wars from the 1940s to the 1960s, but in the last 2 decades, Republicans have tended to support foreign wars. Okay. And I got on election time. It's a good time to tell you some zingers. The presidents will often every year is they have the White House Correspondents' Dinners, and so the president hosts the certain correspondents are assigned just to the White House. And so you'll see the same people over and over asking the president questions at press conferences because that's their unique assignment, and they have to specifically get credentials in order to cover what's going on in the White House, meaning the president. White House is code for the White House announced today. That's code for the president. Okay, so couple of my favorites. Barack Obama at the 2016 White House Correspondents' Dinner. So this was his last year in office. He said, "In my final year, my approval ratings keep going up. The last time I was this high, I was trying to decide on my major." So unlike Clinton, he apparently inhaled. A famous comment attributed to Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge's nickname was Silent Cal. He was a man of extremely few words. After a young woman sitting next to him at a dinner party said she had bet that she could get him to say at least 3 words of conversation, he turned to her and said, "You lose." Donald Trump. Now, you may recall during his election campaign in 2016 at the Republican National Convention, his wife Melania read a speech that was largely taken word for word, also called verbatim for you word fans, from a speech Michelle Obama had made previously. And so Donald Trump's comment was, "The media is even more biased than ever before. Ever. You want the proof? Michelle Obama gives a speech. Everyone loves it. It's fantastic. They think she's absolutely great. My wife Melania gives the exact same speech and people get on her case." Okay, special interest groups. A political organization of people who seek to address some economic or social issue. Okay, so whatever issue you are interested in, there's a special interest group who represents that thinking for you in Washington and in all the state capitals, whether it's the environment, whether it's workers' benefits, livable wage, you name it, there is a special interest group that represents you. And so what they do is they convey information, meaning they convey information to members of the legislature and the state level, or members of Congress at the federal level, telling them how you should go. And on every issue, each person, each legislator is getting both the pro and the con, because there are people who support this and there are special interest groups who oppose it. So they're getting all this information all the time and kind of pressuring, lobbying, as we say, the legislators to vote in a certain way when that issue comes up for vote. Regarding the agenda of special interest groups and their lobbying and influence in Washington, the most powerful are concerned with economic issues. So big business has been associated with wealth, which has been associated with Republicans/conservatives, whereas labor has been associated with, okay, we ain't got the money, but we got the numbers, which has been associated with liberals and Democrats historically. There are currently 11,000 registered lobbyists just in Washington, D.C. That's 11,000 lobbyists working on 550 legislators and their staffs. Lincoln Steffens observed, "Politics is business. That's what's the matter with it. That's what's the matter with everything." So for the exam, you need to know about on page 478, political action committees, also called PACs. Get it? Political action. It's an organization formed by a special interest group, independent of political parties, to pursue political aims by raising and spending money. Now, PACs were a result of campaign financing reform. Oh gosh, when was this? I think it was the late 70s. But anyway, up until that time, um, let's suppose I'm one of the two senators from Texas, Texas being historically a big oil drilling state. And so I'm an oil billionaire. And I want to make sure that anything that comes up in Washington that has anything to do with my interests on oil, I get what I want. So what could I do? I could go to the two senators who are from Texas and say to them, here's the deal. I'm going to donate a gazillion dollars to each of your reelection campaigns. And yeah, just remember, I donated a gazillion dollars to your election campaigns. Now, it is illegal for him to say, when this vote comes up, you vote for me in the way you vote for this because I gave you campaign money. That's illegal. That's called quid pro quo. You can't do that. But it's just understood. Yeah, I donated all this money. Clearly, you know, I'm an oil billionaire. Get it? Okay, we got it. We got it. Check. Okay. So they said, well, that's not fair because how do you and I get a politician or a hip pocket? We ain't got billions of a gazillion dollars to give to a politician. So the government, federal government, actually Congress passed campaign finance law, reform laws, which said you can't donate that kind of money directly to a candidate. In fact, they cap how much you can donate to a candidate for that candidate's primary campaign and reelection campaign. So it's approximately $5,000 to each, and that's it. That's the cap, right? Okay, so that way you and I, or the average schmoes, have an opportunity to gather up $5,000 between us and at least match what the Texas oil billionaires contributing to the campaigns. Okay, so how do you get around this? Think about it. What's the function of a lawyer? Find the legal loophole. Okay, so let me throw it out again. You can only donate X amount of money to a political action committee. That's right. How do you get around it? You form many, many, many political action committees, all of which are funneling money to your campaign, and that's perfectly legal. And you know, you call them really interesting things like Americans for Oil, or Americans reducing their dependence on foreign oil, or whatever, something that sounds really impressive. That sounds like you're quite the patriot. And that way you can have all kinds of money coming in. Now, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party also have political action committees that can donate money to them. Now, one way of getting around this, another way of getting around this was you can donate unlimited amounts to an issue as long as you don't say vote for so-and-so. You notice how with the campaign ads, they always say at the end, I am Joe Biden, I am Donald Trump, and I endorse this, this ad. And so you can't do that in issue things. So let's say, how's the Texas oil billionaire get around this? So he'll buy all kinds of TV advertising around election time, and it'll be, I believe, America's freedom depends on not being dependent on foreign oil. And so everything we can do to make sure that oil continues to get pumped in Texas, we absolutely need to do. Okay, now that's all he or she can say. However, you might notice that the two senators running from Texas are running on that same campaign thinking. They're saying, hey, we can't be dependent on foreign oil, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the issue thing, you don't say vote for these two schmoes. It's just understood, you see. So that's how they get around it. Why is it important? Because it's still really significant how much TV advertising you purchase. Just look at how we're flooded with it. Even though it's much cheaper and probably even more of an outreach to go on social media, Nevertheless, TV advertising is still very powerful, and that's where the big money is focused, television advertising. Why? Because we, the American public, firmly believe if it's on TV, it must be true. Anyway, um, it was really interesting up until usually whoever had the most campaign money, typically had a huge advantage going into the campaign. And largely because of the influence of PAC money in campaigns, typically 90 to 95% of incumbents get reelected. Why? Because they get the PAC money. If you're the new person on the street, they don't even know you yet. Businesses and people aren't going to invest in you. Your friends are, but it's really hard to raise money. That's why, for example, it's astounding to me that Lindsey Graham, who is a well-known senator from South Carolina, has been dramatically outspent by a newcomer, a Democrat running against him. He has something like $57 million to spend going into the last few weeks of the election, which was double anything Lindsey Graham had at the time. Anyway, but it was interesting because Trump kind of flipped that around. Trump did not necessarily have the most money in the last campaign, but nevertheless, he got elected anyway. Now, why? Because in the primary campaign, he didn't need money. What he does is if nothing else, he is a TV savant, from doing the reality TV show and all that. And so he always thinks in terms of how's it appearance, how's this going to appear on TV? And so he would get on during the primary and just say outrageous stuff, which he certainly doesn't say anymore. But he'd say outrageous stuff because he knew he was getting free publicity. People would cover him, the cameras would cover him, the media would cover him just because he was saying such outrageous stuff. Thank God he's calmed down on that. Anyway, so he got through without having to raise as much money as other candidates had to raise. Well, anyway, there were going into this election. So once election time comes on, the number of PACs increased dramatically. But going into this election, there were over 6,000 PACs, political action committees, legally registered political action committees. Then the big change became with the Supreme Court decision that decided a few years ago, actually, could be maybe it's 10 years ago, I'm losing track of time, but time is not. So anyway, about 10 years ago, the US Supreme Court said that a corporation has the same legal rights as an individual in terms of campaign financing. And this was under free speech rights. Therefore, it allowed corporations to contribute lavish amounts to campaigns. And it was kind of interesting because initially the liberals, the Democrats all went cried foul and oh my God, because the Republicans are associated with big business, they'll raise so much more money than we can ever raise for our candidates. And these are called super PACs. But as time went on, there are also Democrat super PACs that are just as financially well endowed as are the Republicans. So it just added yet another level of campaign spending that has made it outrageous. And the more these big corporate interests donate, the less influential you and I become in the campaign process. Because again, they do remember who contributed to the campaign. So here's how it works now. And even the parties do the same thing. A great example, I thought, was in the 2016 election, the person who was running as the US representative, part of his district included Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is the home of Northwest Airlines. Now, he's not the incumbent, but he's the newbie. And as he's running for office, he contacts the people at Northwest Airlines saying, if I'm elected, I'm of course going to be representing you. Perhaps we should chat so they can understand your needs and represent you in the best way possible. Never even called the dude back. The day after he got elected in a surprise upset win, he got a call personally from the chairman of the board of Northwest Airlines. All of a sudden, we'll talk to you. Yeah, because you're the elected candidate. Now, the party will do the same thing, and you're seeing this firsthand how it all works out. So let's suppose a key vote's coming up, and the party says to you, listen, we need you, you're a Democrat, we need you all vote together on this one. We need the entire Democratic vote, entire Republican vote. And if you do, when you're up for reelection, we'll max out. We'll give you all the power of the party behind your reelection. And if you don't, we never heard from you when you run for reelection. Well, what does that mean when you get the power of the party behind you? What it means is you're running for election and you're Joe Schmo, and all of a sudden luminaries, national luminaries from the party are coming to your district and speaking on your behalf and even pretending they know you. And so your local constituents are going, well, my God, I didn't know he knows Bill Clinton. He doesn't. But Bill Clinton's going to speak for you because you voted the party line. And the same thing happens with the Republicans. They'll bring in some luminary from the Republican Party to speak on your behalf because you voted the party line. So the point being, all these people who contributed to your reelection campaign, all these corporations, when it comes time to vote, they expect you to remember them so they can remember you again for your reelection. Former Vice President Walter Mondale said, I think it's time to declare that the government of the United States is not up for sale. Too late. Charles Dudley Warner said, politics makes strange bedfellows, as do shows like ER and, all they are is they're like soap operas at night and a lot of strange bedfellows. Okay. To give you an example of where does the PAC money come from, this is just by category. Now, it's proportionally the same at the state level as well. But the biggest contributors are finance, insurance, and real estate corporations. Then comes miscellaneous lawyers and lobbyists. Then comes healthcare industry. Then comes the communications, electronics industry, the agribusiness industry, energy and natural resources, transportation, construction, defense industries, miscellaneous business, and somewhere in that mix, you might find labor spending as well. But 9 out of the 10 are all big corporate interests that are the biggest donors to campaigns locally, or statewide and nationally. So you wonder, geez, I wonder when the laws are passed, do they tend to favor these powerful corporations and business interests? Of course they do. How could it be otherwise? Which leads us to voter apathy on page 478. The concern is, why do only about 60 to 65% of the eligible voters in the US vote in presidential elections? And it's much less in state and local elections, which is even more interesting because you might even know the candidate at the state and local level and people still don't vote. Now, we'll see what happens, but so far we are heading for a record number of voters in this election because look how divided the country is. So we already had, as of this speaking, we had over 60 million people who have already voted, and we are still about 4 or 5 days before the election here in 2020. Cousin Woodman said, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. Okay, older people vote more than younger people. High-income people vote more than low-income people do. Generally, those with a higher stake or bigger stake in society vote more. Okay, so if you feel disenfranchised, if you're at the bottom of the economic totem pole, you go, what's the point? I'm getting screwed no matter who's in office. This is why, and so low-income people are disproportionately minorities, are disproportionately, I shouldn't say it, there are more white people who are low income than there are minorities, but many minorities are low income people. And so the key is, how do you get the low income people out to vote? And because that's the Democrats' problem. A recent ABC News poll found that among non-registered, An ABC News poll found that among registered non-voters, the most common explanation for not voting was no time, 30%. Yes. Who can spare a day? Because now it probably takes a day to vote. Who can spare a day every 4 years? I know I can't. Poor health was 20%. Well, of course, I mean, getting ready to vote is like training for the decathlon. You got to be in the gym every day. It's not easy to get in there and mail that ballot and send it back or go in there and push those buttons. You got to be in top shape. Couldn't get to the polls. That was 10%. Could get to the bar, just couldn't get to the polls. Uh, and again, that's why you will see people will offer rides to make sure people get to this is the Democrats in particular. I'll help you get to the polls. Don't you worry. That's not going to be an issue. This analysis found no evidence that non-voters differ in attitudes from voters. You know, I don't want to appear to be too political, so I'm not going to apply this to any particular politician. But H.L. Mencken once said, "No man ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American voter." Think about that in terms of who we've elected in over the past many years. Okay. So conservatives argue that voter apathy is indifference to politics. People just don't care. Liberals argue it's alienation from politics, that people feel disconnected from the whole political process. Think about it. Think how disconnected we are from the government. We don't think of the government as us. We think of the government as them. But the government is supposed to be us. We, the people, is represented through the government. The government's supposed to be acting in our best interest, but we don't think of it that way at all. We think of the government as them, not us. Well, a key point is the two parties offer the same basic rap. It's just different variations on the same capitalist theme. If there were a wider spectrum of opinion, as there is in Europe, people would have more reason to vote. Basically, people feel that elections don't make enough of a difference. At least they did up until this year. Now, I think people feel it does make a significant difference. So, for example, in Western European countries where Greens Party, environmental party, is very popular, the way it works out in some of the countries is if the Green Party gets 32% of the votes, they get 32% of the seats in the national legislature. That's not how it works here. Um, and one of the reasons why you don't see a third party candidate even get to be in the national debates is because the debates are organized by a commission that sounds real highfalutin, but it's basically a commission that is organized by the Republican and Democratic parties. They're not going to let a third candidate get up there and speak. It's a closed shop like in a union. Okay. On page 479, we're going to start talking, you're going to start listening, God, I hope, to the theoretical analysis of power in society, beginning with the pluralist model. So there's two competing models. The pluralist model is kind of the way we learned it in high school, and it's kind of an ideal version of how we think about it, and perhaps the way it's maybe largely worked in America. But it's an analysis of politics in which power is dispersed among many competing interest groups. Now, it's rooted in the structural functional paradigm. Once again, is structural functionalism politically conservative or politically liberal? That's right, it's conservative. And by the way, when was the Industrial Revolution? That's right, 1750. When did modern times begin? That's right, 1750. Yes, with the Industrial Revolution. You got it. Okay, so rooted in the structural functional paradigm, the pluralist model asserts that politics is negotiation and compromise. In the diverse US society, special interest groups represent and promote the needs and interests of various peoples and compete to shape those policies friendly to their interests. Also, power has many sources which are spread out across society. So as a result, no one group has all the power. In fact, research indicates that even the most disadvantaged groups in society can effectively organize and impact key policies. So yes, there are all these special interest groups. And, there's the environmentalists and there's big business. And sometimes the environmentalists get their ways and sometimes the big business gets their ways. And many times the laws that are passed according to the pluralist model are a compromise between the environmentalists and big business. Okay, in contrast to this, on page 480 is the power elite model, which is not the people rule, but only a few people rule. This is an analysis of politics holding that power is concentrated among the rich. This was developed by C. Wright Mills, a maverick sociologist who wrote a book called The Power Elite in 1956. The Power Elite was one of those books that, everybody thinks, oh, everything was so hunky-dory, happy, and, Leave It to Beaver and all that in the 1950s. But there was a lot of unrest and dissension. And his book was one of those books that talked about, things aren't going the way you think they're going. So he, by the way, when I say he was a maverick sociologist, I don't know what a sociologist looked like in the 1950s, but I imagine it was a three-piece suit and perhaps smoking a pipe and, a goatee and carrying his briefcase to work. Typically he, by the way. But this dude rode in on a motorcycle. He had a Harley and he had a cowboy hat and, and cowboy boots and stuff. So kind of a different guy. He said the super rich forge alliances with one another and through the political, military, business systems effectively ensure that their priorities become the national agenda. They move between these three sectors, consolidating their power. Okay, so let me give you some examples. If you go back to W's administration, his chief of state was Colin Powell. Colin Powell came from the military. So prior to that, in the Persian Gulf War, he was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military position in the Pentagon. That was him. So he moved from the military into the political sector. Okay, another example. Cheney, the vice president at that time, the dark, stiff Lord Cheney. Anyway, he he was in politics back in the 60s and 70s. Then he moved into the business world, and he was a high-ranking executive at an international firm called Halliburton. Then W tapped him to be his vice president. And as the legend goes, he pretty much ran things because W didn't have a clue, so he just followed whatever Cheney told him to do. I'm just saying legend has it. I don't know that that's a fact, but he was pretty powerful in the decision making there. Okay, so he moves from politics to the business sector back to politics, and then we invade Iraq. Now, the problem with the Iraq invasion is we had no escape plan. And so once we got in there, we just figured, okay, we'll kick ass. That's it. We leave. No, 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 no. It was a quagmire, which is why his father, Daddy Bush, warned Sonny, don't go into Iraq because you'll never get out. And as it turns out, he was absolutely true. So they had no escape plan. They're stuck there. And now they got to rebuild Iraq because they tore it apart. And so, what corporation can we possibly get to rebuild Iraq? Could it be Halliburton? Yes, that's exactly who got the contract. What a coincidence. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, to give you some more contemporary examples, who was the head of the State Department, our leading ambassador to the rest of the world, the first one under the Trump administration, because he's dismissed most of them, until he could finally find people who would just agree with him. It was the former head, the CEO of ExxonMobil. So he was a giant in the oil world, came from business, goes into the political world, right? So this is what, or I'll give you another example. Let's suppose you're working for the Air Force and you're a lifer, you're in there for 20 years, and your job is you buy materials to make planes for the Air Force, okay? Well, who are you buying them from? You're buying them from companies like Boeing and other companies. And so your 20 years are up, you're still in your 40s, you have a career ahead of you, you can still collect your full government pension. And so guess who hires you? Could it be Boeing, the same people you were buying product from? Yes, that's exactly right. What else happens? Let's suppose you're running for, you're a US representative, which means you are running for reelection constantly. You're up for reelection every 2 years. Well, you get sick of being on the treadmill, but you like the power of being in Washington, like big cars and fancy women, or fancy cars and big women. I don't know. It's all good, right? And so what happens, one of the big lobbying firms comes up to you and says, look, you must be tired of running on this reelection treadmill all the time. Why don't you just come to work for us? You can still stay in Washington. Now you can lobby the people who you used to work with in in Congress. Get it? So these people move back and forth between the military, the business, and the political sectors. And as a result, they're always making sure that the agenda of those establishments, the business and the military world, are the agenda for the national. It becomes the national agenda. C. Wright Mills said, the power elite is composed of men whose positions enable them to transcend the ordinary environments and ordinary men and women. They are in positions to make decisions have major consequences. Within American society, major national power now resides in the economic, the political, and the military domains. Now, this is related to the social conflict paradigm, which you'll remember is liberal radical. Related to social conflict paradigm, the power elite model does not see this as an anti-American conspiracy. It's more of a self-perpetuating system of privilege that enables the very wealthy to always be in leadership positions in the United States. Some would argue that it's a self-conscious attitude of the better people, the more able leaders, the aristocracy, paternalistically, like Big Daddy, running the country on behalf of the less capable masses. So, the thinking here would be families like the Bush family and the Kennedy family. They will heroically serve the country and run it for us, because if it was left to us, we're just dumbass sheep, bah, and we're not capable of running it for ourselves. So thank God we have these people who will lead for us. Marx and Engels wrote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the affairs of the whole bourgeois. The power elite model shoots holes in the theory that the US is a pluralist political democracy. Okay, listen to this observation by the late Supreme Court Justice Louis D. Brandeis. He said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have wealth in a few hands, but we can't have both. Well, I think we do have wealth in a few hands. Remember the stat you're supposed to have known for the second exam? Done, Maynard, out of mind, that was over. Okay, which was that 20% of the people control almost 90% of all the wealth, the total wealth of the United States. We clearly have wealth in a few hands. So according to him, we no longer have democracy. The rich are running the show. Well, the table on page 481 compares and critiques these models. More recent research seems to indicate that there are limits to the democratic nature of the United States. Groups are able to shape policies as long as they fit within or do not threaten the larger agenda of the power elite. Even at that, the powerful do not always get their way. Now, let me give you another example. Dwight Eisenhower was this really laid back, moderate Republican. There actually used to be such a thing. There still is, Mitt Romney, moderate Republican who was president in the 1950s. Remember, C. Wright Mills wrote this book in 1956, warning the public this is going down. Well, in his farewell speech to the public, Eisenhower also warned the American public of the growing power of the military industrial elite and how it's beginning to run the country. Which of course leads us to political revolution, the overthrow of one political system in favor of another. Do I have some quotes here? Yes, Winston Churchill said, a fanatic is one who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. This is important to know. Peter Berger said, since all political systems were created by people and actually maintained by people, it follows that people can also change them. Remember, the only reason the current systems continue is because every day we continue to support it. We continue to participate in it. If the people say, We refuse to participate anymore. That's the end. Um, you've seen that proven conclusively by the civil rights movement in the 1950s, and you saw it with Gandhi's movement to free India of British control. Not advocating it, just telling you. Terrorism, acts of violence or the threat of violence used as a political strategy by an individual or group. Back when he was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Army, and then later on just the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat was constantly considered to be a terrorist by Washington, meaning the White House. He said, terrorist, who says that? George Washington was called a terrorist by the British, which is exactly true. You may recall from history, the first battle of the Revolution was fought at Lexington and Concord. And so here you had the British who were all marching, in rows, and you had the Americans who at that point didn't even have an army. And so they could not respond by standing in the field and fighting them that way. They would just get mowed down. So what they did is they took to the bushes and started picking them off. And they even did something that is just, you just don't do that. They were picking off the officers, killing the officers as the British fled back to Boston. And so that's considered terrorism, to fight that way. So one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Henry David Thoreau, another good read along with 1984 is Civil Disobedience. It won't take you long, but in there, in Civil Disobedience, Henry David Thoreau talked about the need for civil disobedience if necessary. And he said, not only do you have the right to fight unjust laws or unjust regimes, you have the responsibility to do so. He also said, and this was in reference to the Trail of Tears, which will, the Indian Removal Act that was passed in the early 1800s. We'll talk a little bit more about when we get to religion. He said, how does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace become associated with it. War and peace. The cost of militarism. It's $1.8 trillion worldwide. That's how much we spend on military. That comes out to $240 per person. That's all whatever it is now, 0.3 billion of us, $240 per person, man, woman, and child is spent on the military. Now think about it. That's more than the gross annual income in the poorest nations of the world. Some people only have $200 gross annual income, and it comes out to $240 per person just spent on the military around the world. In poor nations, there are 6 times more soldiers than there are physicians. The U.S. spends approximately $700 billion on defense, which is approximately 20% of the total U.S. budget. But that spending accounts for 41% of the world's total military spending. In other words, our military budget accounts for 41% of the total world budget spent on the military. This is what's referred to as the military-industrial complex. It's big business, a lot of money. Also, the number one arms seller to the rest of the world is who? Us, the United States. And we don't care, we'll sell it to you. Now, a really interesting thing, and I won't spend a lot of time on it because I know you got plenty, you've already been sitting long enough, but a recent deal was cut with the Trump administration whereby the United Arab Emirates, and I forget what the other country was, I think it was Bahrain, have both recognized Israel. Now, this was a revolutionary move because all the Arab states agreed about 20 years ago, they refused to recognize Israel as a state. In other words, if we refuse to recognize it, they can never exist as a state, blah, 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 blah. And so these two Arab nations broke the accord by recognizing Israel. Now, why? Is because what the Trump administration has done, Obama was trying to work with Iran, good, bad, or indifferent, And he kind of opposed Saudi Arabia as being a purveyor of violence in the Middle East. Um, and certainly recognizing Iran was as well, but nevertheless, he tried to work with Iran, particularly because they were getting ready to develop a nuclear bomb. And so he tried to prevent that from happening. As you may recall, one of the first things Trump did is pull us out of that arranged agreement with Iran. So he has taken a different approach. He is going heavily against Iran and supported Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia and Iran are bitter enemies, okay? So those two countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, tend to side on the Saudi Arabian end of the conflict. And so Trump enlisted them because, it's more opposition to Iran. And that way they support Israel, which, if you notice, he's been a huge benefactor of Israel. Up until now, the argument was Palestine should be a unique state, a unique country. Israel should be a unique country. But by these two countries swinging over and recognizing Israel, it effectively sells out Palestine. Right? It says, you guys are on your own, So by not recognizing Israel, we support you, but that's passed. Well, why did they do this? What's in it for them? Well, as a result of them agreeing to do this, the United States government has now sold them F-15 jet fighters, top of the line jet fighters, as good as there is in the world. They can now own. Right now, in the past, and this is with Israel's approval, in the past, we would never sell to the other Middle Eastern countries the best product. The best jets would always go to Israel, and the second tier jets would go to the other countries in the Middle East, so that Israel would always have the top jets in case there be a conflict. But not this time. Israel went along with it. They recognize us and isolate Palestine. The United States can then sell them jets. So it was good for the US, for business, for the military industrial complex. They now got jets. But look around the world. When these countries are battling each other, because 1/3 are at war as we speak, where are they getting their arms? They're getting them from either us, Russia, or China. We just sell them to anybody because it's good for business. Okay, so you need to know on page 484, the War and Peace, what are the causes of war? War is organized armed conflict among the people of two or more nations directed by their governments. Thanks to pacts and treaties signed with over 60 countries, the United States is legally bound to defend 25% of the world's population. Okay, perceived threats, first cause of war. Perceived threats may be more perceived than real. So, for example, prior to the Persian Gulf War, the perceived threat was they have weapons of mass destruction. Turns out to be that's not true. And the other assumption is even if they had them, what makes you think they'd necessarily use them against you? Let's suppose you and your neighbor are not getting along and your neighbor suddenly gets some vicious dog. It doesn't mean the neighbor got the vicious dog to attack you, or the neighbor buys a gun. It doesn't necessarily mean the neighbor bought a gun to attack you. It just means the neighbor now has a vicious dog and has a gun. So two big assumptions there, both of which turned out to be incorrect. And the other assumption that was not true that led to the invasion of the Iraq was that the Al-Qaeda was in close contact and worked together with Saddam Hussein, the then leader of Iraq, and that turned out to not be true either. Nevertheless, we invaded Iraq. Two, social problems. Internal problems and political needs often lead to war against neighbors. Why? Because war detracts attention from internal social problems, and it's a show of force. Every leader knows this. If you're not looking good in the political polls, what do? You make it seem as though there's an external threat to the United States. And so then everybody quickly rallies around the flag. And even if you detest the president, you rally around the flag because this is a time when Americans can't dissent. We have to all rally around the war effort here. So a lot of times leaders will create an outside threat that isn't actually there to scare the people enough into thinking, oh my God, we all need to rally around the leader. Everybody knows this. All leaders understand this, that when the people are afraid, they're easy to manipulate, right? So all you have to do is get the people fearful, and it's easy to manipulate them. 3, political objective. War is a tool of force to enhance global political standing. It's a show of force. And so or to end foreign domination, as we attempted to try to do in Vietnam. And so, for example, we'll have joint military operations with the South Koreans, just to show the North Koreans, see, we're tight here, see all our ships, see all our planes, see all our troops, don't mess with us. 4, moral objectives. You always cloak your cause with morality and you paint the opposition as the devil incarnate. In my course that I teach on peace studies, there's a video I show, and it shows all the political cartoons that are always produced during war. And it's great because we always portray the opposite side as scum, subhuman, rodents, whatever. They deserve to die. They're not even human, because how else do you get people to kill people in a war? But you have to make them less than human. But they paint us the same way. That's the best part. So if you look at political cartoons in that country, who's the enemy, that's exactly how they characterize us, to enable their troops to kill us, because we're less than human. We're the devil incarnate. Yeah. And so on and on and on it goes. And 5th, the absence of alternatives. The United Nations is an example of a forum to mediate conflict, to give us alternatives to war. Former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, said, "Forgive your enemies, but never forget their names." There was an ancient Roman dictum that if you seek peace, prepare for war. The intensity of war has increased with time. 3/4 of all deaths from war since Julius Caesar's time occurred in the 20th century. I will also point out to you that in current wars, 95% of all the dead are civilians. That's predictable, that's knowable. In all wars, 95% of the people killed are civilians in modern wars. The Grand Duke Constantine of Russia said, "I detest war, it spoils my armies." The Grand Duke must have had like little figurines on his, table. And Sigmund Freud said, "A fear of weapons is a sign of sexual immaturity." Kind of explains why guys like big guns. See if you get that one. Okay, Pursuing Peace on page 487. Okay, so let me launch a little bit into the spiritual realm. The external world is nothing more than a mirror of the internal world of our minds. What's in here is projected out there, whether individually or collectively. Since war was created in the minds of men, then logically, if we can change our minds, we can have peace. Napoleon Hill said, "A primary method for gaining a mind full of peace is to practice emptying the mind." Not during an exam, however. Okay, so what are ways to pursue peace? Number 1, deterrence, the so-called balance of a power approach to security. This was under the heading of what was known during when we had massive numbers of nuclear arms between us and the Soviet Union. It was called mutually assured destruction. Now think about it. That's an acronym for MAD, and it was sheer madness. So again, at the height of the Cold War, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons between the two nations. And these were warheads that made everything that was used, that made the atomic weapons, because these are hydrogen bombs, not nuclear bombs. So they make the nuclear bombs used in the atomic bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like tinker toys by comparison. So the whole idea was this: mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union will never push the button to attack us. Why? Because they know if they do, we'll push the button and wipe them out, right? And so the question became, and they knew the same thing about us. We'll never push the button because they know if we push the button and strike first, they'll respond by wiping us out. So then there'd be debates about, can we have a first strike capability that knocks out enough of their capability that they can't respond enough to wipe us out. So the whole point is nobody will ever push the button because of mutually assured destruction. Mad. Well, there are three problems with this. One is it caused an enormously expensive arms race. Two, it has little effort on preventing nuclear deterrence. So, for example, when the Soviet Union broke up, many of its previous countries under its rule, like Kazakhstan and others, had nuclear weapons. Where they all accounted for? Some claim they weren't. Where are they now? Are they with rogue regimes? Who knows? So nuclear deterrence means the spread of nuclear weapons, or it didn't. The fact that there were nuclear arms and we even have nuclear arms treaties doesn't mean that a country like Iran can't develop a nuclear weapon. Israel probably has one. They won't admit that they do. And look at how much gravitas that North Korea has received as a result of having a nuclear weapon. Anyway, three, it does little to stop terrorism and to prevent war started by a powerful nation against a weaker foe. So, in fact, we used to operate on what was called the nuclear umbrella. So, since everybody knew we were the big bad US and we had nuclear weapons, we could pretty much do whatever we wanted to do with our conventional armies, like invade Afghanistan, because who's going to stop us? We got nukes. Two, by the way, as an aside, I'm happily saw that the Trump administration decided to extend for one more year the treaty we have with the Soviet Union, with Russia rather, to get rid of all their nuclear weapons, because the Trump administration was going to put a halt to it. So fortunately, it's postponed for 1 year. Anyway, a second way to pursue peace is high technology defense. Now, high technology defense, if you go back to Reagan, remember he was a movie star, so he liked the Star Wars films. So he referred to this as the Star Wars Initiative. Now, what it was is, and I'm channeling Austin Powers on this, is we will have satellites in the sky with lasers, and these lasers will shoot down missiles that are coming into the United States and just obliterate them before they even get close to destroying us. There was only one problem. No such technology existed at the time of Reagan. Okay, so then when W became president, he reinitiated it and called it something different, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Same thing, lasers on satellites, but there is no such technology. And at one point, they tried to fake a test that showed that it worked, and then a whistleblower showed that it was a fake test. And when Obama became president, he just abandoned the whole thing. Three, diplomacy and disarmament, a step forward, but all must be willing to engage in it in order to make it work. So you can't have diplomacy unless both sides agree to mediate, to have a discussion to prevent war or end war. And you can't have disarmament unless both sides agree to do so. And finally, the most important of all, resolving underlying conflict. This is the key to finding peace. See, peace isn't the absence of war. Peace is the absence of conditions that create war. That's why there's that famous slogan, no justice, no peace. No socioeconomic justice, there will be no peace. Hubert H. Humphrey, former Vice President of the United States, said, when we discuss national security, we tend too often to give it a military label. It is in fact much broader than military power and much more complex. There can be no security without social betterment. Leon Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Plato said, only the dead have seen the end of war. Pope Leo XIII said, nothing is more important than the war on war. This is a quote from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Quote, it will be a great day when our schools get all the money they need and the Air Force has to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. Hey, I'll make some brownies. Carl Sandburg said, someday they'll give a war and nobody will come. Ernest Hemingway said, never think that war, no matter how necessary, no matter how justified, is not a crime. And finally, Herodotus said, sons bury their fathers in times of peace. In times of war, fathers bury their sons. That's all we got. Thanks for your patience. I know that was a long chapter, but it is the way it is. See you next time for chapter 19. Stay safe. Take care.